16 bombers. 80 men. One impossible mission that changed everything. On April 18, 1942, something occurred that the Empire of Japan believed was physically impossible. American bombers appeared in the skies over Tokyo, not from some distant island base, but from the void of the Pacific itself. In a span of 7 hours, the myth of an impregnable homeland evaporated like morning fog beneath the rising sun. The bombs that fell that day barely scratched the physical landscape, yet they detonated something far more devastating within the Japanese psyche. They shattered an illusion that had taken centuries to build. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The attack killed fewer than 90 people. It destroyed a handful of buildings. Military strategists would later call it tactically insignificant. But those strategists were looking at the wrong map. The true damage was invisible, immeasurable, and permanent. In the imperial palace, in the war ministry, in the hearts of civilians who had been promised absolute safety, a crack appeared. And through that crack, doubt began to pour in like seawater into a breached hull. This is not a story about how much destruction 16 bombers could cause. This is a story about how a nation's confidence became its greatest vulnerability. About how 80 Americans flew into certain death and somehow survived long enough to prove that the impossible was merely improbable. About the moment Japan realized it had awakened something it could never put back to sleep. The raiders flew into history believing they would never return. Most of them were right, though not in the way they expected. What they didn't know, what nobody could have predicted, was that their mission would force Japan into a series of catastrophic decisions that would ultimately seal the empire's fate. The Doolittle raid didn't just embarrass Japan. It terrified them. And terrified nations make desperate choices. In the winter months of early 1942, Tokyo existed in a peculiar state of euphoria mixed with disbelief. Just weeks earlier, Japanese forces had struck Pearl Harbor with devastating precision. The photographs flooding newspapers showed American battleships capsized in Hawaiian waters, their hulls exposed like the bellies of harpooned whales. The Philippines were falling. Singapore would soon follow. Across the vast theater of the Pacific, the rising sun flag climbed higher with each passing day. In the streets of the capital, citizens walked with a pride that bordered on intoxication. Schoolchildren sang patriotic songs while waving miniature flags. Merchants painted victory slogans on their shop windows. At night, families gathered around radios to hear announcements of fresh conquests, each one pushing the boundaries of empire further outward, further away from the sacred soil of the homeland. The message hammered into every Japanese mind was simple and absolute. The home islands were untouchable. Geography itself was their guardian. Thousands of miles of ocean stretched between Japan and any enemy capable of mounting an air assault. The Imperial Navy controlled those waters with an iron fist. Even if somehow, impossibly, enemy aircraft carriers ventured close enough to launch planes, the outer ring of patrol boats and reconnaissance aircraft would spot them days in advance. Defense fighters would scramble. The carriers would be found and destroyed long before their bombers could reach Japan's shores. This wasn't mere propaganda. It was mathematical certainty backed by decades of military doctrine. Japanese strategists had calculated the ranges, studied the maps, analyzed every conceivable scenario. The conclusion was unanimous. Strategic bombing of the Japanese mainland by enemy forces was a physical impossibility given the current state of aviation technology and carrier positioning. The homeland existed in a bubble of invulnerability, protected not by walls or weapons, but by simple tyranny of distance. Military leaders spoke of this protection with religious conviction. High-ranking officers assured the emperor that no hostile aircraft would ever darken Tokyo's sky. The public believed them because the alternative was unthinkable. For a culture that had built its identity around the concept of divine protection, or around the idea that their islands were blessed and shielded by the gods themselves, the notion of enemy bombers over the capital was not just unlikely. It was blasphemous. Yet while Japan basked in its perceived security, across the Pacific, a very different conversation was taking place. In the cramped offices of American military planners, maps were spread across tables. Fingers traced routes across thousands of miles of open water. Calculations were scribbled on chalkboards, erased, and rewritten. The question being asked was not whether Japan could be bombed. The question was how. The attack on Pearl Harbor had left America reeling, desperate for any response that could restore morale and prove the war was not already lost. President Roosevelt himself had demanded action. Strike back at Japan. Hit them where they feel safe. Show them that distance is not the same as safety. But how? Every conventional approach led to the same dead end. Carriers couldn't get close enough without being detected and destroyed. Land bases in the Pacific were either captured or out of range. The mathematics that protected Japan seemed ironclad. Then someone asked a different question. What if bombers didn't return to a carrier? What if they flew one way, landing somewhere else entirely? The idea was radical, borderline suicidal, and it opened a sliver of possibility. If bombers could launch from a carrier but didn't need to land back on it, the carrier could stay further out. Far enough to avoid detection. Maybe. The plan that emerged was audacious to the point of madness. Load Army Air Force bombers, which had never been designed for carrier operations, onto the deck of a Navy carrier. Sail that carrier as close to Japan as possible without being spotted. Launch the bombers on a one-way trip to strike Tokyo and other cities, then have them fly onward to land in unoccupied China. Every element of the plan violated standard procedure. Army bombers on Navy carriers. One-way missions. Coordination with Chinese forces through hostile territory. The margin for error was non-existent. The man chosen to lead this impossible mission was Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a pilot whose reputation rested on pushing aircraft to their absolute limits. Doolittle was not a conventional officer. He was an engineer, a scientist, a racer who had set speed records and pioneered instrument flying. If anyone could make bombers perform tasks they were never designed for, it was him. When briefed on the mission parameters, Doolittle didn't hesitate. He understood what was being asked. Fly into the most heavily defended airspace in the Pacific with planes too large, too heavy, and too slow for the task. Do it knowing that capture meant torture and execution. Do it anyway. Volunteers were called for without being told the mission details. Men were simply informed it would be extremely hazardous with little chance of survival. Every single airman in the unit stepped forward. From that pool, 80 men were selected. Pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners, and engineers. They trained in secret at a remote airfield, practicing short takeoffs again and again. They didn't know where they were going. They didn't know when. They knew only that the runway would be shorter than any bomber had ever used and that coming back was not part of the plan. The aircraft chosen were B-25 Mitchell bombers. Sturdy, reliable, but entirely unsuited for carrier operations. They were too big, their wingspan too wide, their weight too great. Navy officers looked at them and shook their heads. It violated every principle of naval aviation. Yet modifications began. Extra fuel tanks were installed. Defensive guns were removed to save weight. Every piece of equipment deemed non-essential was stripped out. The bombers were transformed into flying fuel tanks with just enough offensive capability to deliver their payload. Loading them onto the USS Hornet in early April was a spectacle that defied belief. Each bomber had to be positioned with inches of clearance. 16 aircraft crowded the deck so tightly that once loaded, the carrier's own planes couldn't be used. The Hornet had effectively been turned into a one-way floating airstrip. Sailors looked at the bombers lashed to their deck and wondered what madness their ship was sailing toward. As the Hornet left San Francisco Bay, even most of its crew didn't know the destination. Sealed orders. Radio silence. The carrier rendezvoused with the USS Enterprise and supporting vessels, forming Task Force 18. Together they steamed west into the vast emptiness of the Pacific, carrying a secret that would either restore American pride or end in catastrophic failure. For the men aboard those bombers, the voyage was an exercise in suspended time. They maintained their aircraft, checked their equipment, and reviewed maps of cities they'd only seen in photographs. Some wrote letters they weren't allowed to mail. Others played cards or slept fitfully in hammocks strung below deck. A few stared out at the endless water and contemplated what it meant to fly toward an enemy that had never been touched, never been bloodied on their own soil, never been made to feel the terror they had inflicted on others. Meanwhile in Tokyo, cherry blossoms were beginning to bloom. It was the season of renewal, of beauty, of ancient traditions celebrating the ephemeral nature of life. Families planned viewing parties beneath the flowering trees. Poets composed verses about the delicate petals. The symbolism was lost on no one. Beauty, fleeting and fragile, yet returning year after year with certainty. The Japanese military command met in rooms adorned with maps showing their expanding empire. Red markers indicated territory under their control. Blue markers showed the retreating enemy. Every briefing reinforced the same narrative. Victory was inevitable. The Americans were broken. The British were contained. The Chinese were collapsing. And above all, the homeland remained inviolate, protected by the vast moat of the Pacific and the vigilance of the Imperial Navy. No one in those rooms, looking at those maps, tracking those fleet movements, imagined that at that very moment, 2 American carriers were knifing through the ocean toward them. No one calculated that 80 men were preparing to do what every expert had declared impossible. No one considered that in a matter of days, the cherry blossoms would be falling in Tokyo not because of wind, but because of the shockwave from explosions that should never have reached Japanese soil. The fortress that never was about to learn it had always been an illusion. Distance was not a wall. Ocean was not armor. And certainty, no matter how confidently proclaimed, could evaporate in the time it takes a bomb to fall from sky to earth. Japan had spent decades building a mythology of invincibility. 16 bombers were about to fly straight through it. The morning of April 18 began like any other aboard the Hornet. Sailors performed their dawn rituals, engines hummed with their familiar rhythm, and the Pacific stretched endlessly in all directions under a gray sky heavy with moisture. The task force had maintained strict radio silence for days, moving through waters that grew more dangerous with each nautical mile. Every man aboard knew they were deep in hostile territory now, far beyond the protective reach of friendly forces. If Japanese patrol planes spotted them, if submarines found them, there would be no rescue, no reinforcements. They would fight alone and likely die alone. Colonel Doolittle stood on the flight deck as pale light broke across the horizon, his eyes scanning the bombers lined up nose to tail. Each aircraft bore a number but no names, no decorations, nothing that would identify them as American if captured. The crews were already awake, running through final checks with the mechanical precision of men who knew their lives depended on every bolt, every wire, every gauge reading exactly as it should. Some of them were barely out of their 20s, faces still smooth with youth, yet their eyes carried the weight of men who had already made peace with death. The plan called for launching at dusk, arriving over Tokyo under cover of darkness. The bombers would drop their payloads on industrial targets, then continue west toward Chinese airfields where friendly forces waited. At least that was the theory. In practice, night navigation over unfamiliar terrain with limited fuel and no radio contact was a recipe for disaster. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. But it was the only recipe they had, so they would follow it to whatever end awaited. Then at 8 in the morning, everything changed. A lookout spotted a vessel on the horizon. The call went through the ship like an electric current. Japanese patrol boat. Small, but equipped with radio. The Americans had been discovered 650 miles from Tokyo, 200 miles further out than planned. The mission was compromised before a single engine had started. Admiral Halsey commanding the task force faced an impossible decision. Abort and risk the patrol boat reporting their position anyway, bringing the full weight of the Imperial Navy down upon them. Or launch immediately, in broad daylight, from a distance that pushed the bombers beyond their calculated fuel range. Either choice courted disaster. He made his choice in seconds. Launch now. Launch everything. On the Hornet's deck, controlled chaos erupted. The mission they had trained months for was suddenly happening hours early under completely different circumstances. Day instead of night. 650 miles instead of 450. Crews scrambled to their aircraft, pulling on flight gear, grabbing emergency supplies. There was no time for speeches, no dramatic farewells. Just the urgent necessity of getting 16 bombers off a pitching carrier deck before Japanese bombers found them first. Doolittle would go first. His bomber sat at the rear of the deck with barely 460 feet of runway ahead of it, less than half what AB-25 normally required for takeoff. The Hornet pitched in heavy swells, the deck rising and falling like a breathing thing. Navy deck crews knew the timing had to be perfect. Launch as the bow rises, let the upward angle give the bomber that extra fraction of lift it desperately needed. Launch wrong and the aircraft would simply drop off the deck into the ocean, carrying its crew to a quick drowning. Doolittle revved his engines to maximum power, the propellers screaming, the entire aircraft shaking against its will brakes. The deck officer watched the swells, counted the rhythm, waited for the exact moment. Then the flag dropped. Brakes released. The bomber lurched forward, gathering speed far too slowly, eating up deck footage with terrifying hunger. 400 feet. 300. 200. The bow began its upward swing. 100 feet. The bomber was still on the deck. 50 feet. Sailors held their breath. Then Doolittle's aircraft hit the upward angle and clawed into the air, wheels clearing the bow with room measured in feet, not yards. One by one the others followed. Each takeoff was a controlled disaster. Engines roaring at maximum power. Aircraft shuddering down the deck. The sickening moment when the bomber left the carrier and seemed to hang in space, not quite flying, not quite falling. Then the slow painful climb as overloaded wings fought for purchase in the air. Every man aboard the Hornet watched in silence broken only by the thunder of engines and the occasional muttered prayer. 15 minutes after Doolittle launched, all 16 bombers were airborne. The impossible had been accomplished. Army bombers had taken off from a Navy carrier in conditions that should have killed at least half of them. Now came the easy part. Flying 500 miles over open ocean, penetrating the most heavily defended airspace in Asia, bombing targets they could barely identify, then continuing another 1,000 miles to landing fields they'd never seen in a country torn by war. The crew members settled into their positions, checked their instruments, and tried not to think about the fuel gauges that were already lower than they should be. The bombers flew low, just above the wave tops, trying to avoid radar detection. The noise inside was deafening, a constant roar of engines and wind that made communication nearly impossible even through the intercom system. Navigators hunched over their maps and compasses, calculating and recalculating their position based on dead reckoning and hope. There were no landmarks in the empty Pacific, no way to confirm they were on course except faith in mathematics and the skill of their training. Around noon, the first bomber spotted the Japanese coast. A thin dark line separating ocean from sky. Then the line resolved into details. Cliffs. Beaches. The green of vegetation. Land. Enemy land. Hearts hammered faster. Hands gripped controls tighter. This was the point of no return in every sense. Behind them was empty ocean offering no sanctuary. Ahead was a nation that would show no mercy if they were forced down. They came in over fishing villages where people looked up in confusion at the unfamiliar aircraft. Some waved, mistaking them for Japanese planes returning from patrol. The bombers roared overhead at rooftop height, their passage rattling windows and sending chickens scattering. Then they were over farmland, rice paddies reflecting the afternoon sun like scattered mirrors. Farmers working in fields stopped and stared. Children pointed. Nobody understood yet what they were seeing. In Tokyo, the lunch hour was ending. Office workers returned to their desks. Students filed back into classrooms. The city hummed with the ordinary business of existence, completely unaware that death was approaching at 200 miles per hour. Air raid sirens sat silent. Defense fighters remained on the ground. Anti-aircraft batteries were unmanned. Why would they be otherwise? The homeland had never been attacked. The homeland could not be attacked. The laws of distance and geography forbade it. Doolittle's bomber was the first to reach the capital. The city sprawled beneath them, vast and vulnerable. Wooden buildings packed close together. Factories with their distinctive smokestacks. Military installations marked on their target maps. The bombardier lay prone in the nose, eye pressed to his sight, making minute adjustments. The pilot held steady despite every instinct screaming to take evasive action. Flak could start at any second. Fighters could appear from any direction. But the sky remained bizarrely empty. The bomb bay doors opened. Wind screamed through the fuselage. The bombardier's hand moved to the release. Then gravity took over. 500-pound bombs tumbled toward the city below, their fins stabilizing their descent, their fuses armed and waiting. The bomber lifted suddenly, freed of the weight, and banked hard away as the pilot pushed throttles to maximum. Behind them, seconds stretched into eternity. The first explosion occurred near a munitions factory. A flash of orange. A pillar of smoke. Then the shock wave rolled outward, shattering windows for blocks. Before the sound had finished echoing, 3 more blasts erupted across the district. Flames began to lick at wooden structures. People ran into the streets, faces turned upward in shock and incomprehension. Overhead, already distant, the bomber disappeared toward the western horizon. Then the second bomber arrived. And the third. And the fourth. For the next hour, explosions rippled across Tokyo, Yokohama, Osaka, and Nagoya. Bombs fell on steel mills, on oil refineries, on power stations, on shipyards. Not enough bombs to cause strategic damage. Not enough to cripple industry or kill thousands. But enough to ignite fires. Enough to send plumes of black smoke climbing into the afternoon sky. Enough to prove that the impossible had just become reality. On the streets, panic spread faster than the flames. People had no frame of reference for what was happening. Air raids were something that occurred in China, in distant war zones. Not here. Not in the sacred heart of the empire. The sirens that should have wailed remained silent because no one had thought to sound them. There was no procedure for this. No plan. No preparation. The entire elaborate system of civil defense existed only on paper because the scenario it was meant to address was supposed to be impossible. Military commanders reacted with confusion bordering on paralysis. Reports flooded in from multiple cities simultaneously. American bombers over the capital. American bombers over Yokohama. It made no sense. Where had they come from? Carriers should have been spotted days ago. Land bases were thousands of miles away. Some officers initially refused to believe the reports, insisting they must be Japanese planes conducting exercises. But the explosions were real. The fires were real. And the aircraft bore unmistakable markings that no amount of denial could erase. Fighter pilots scrambled to their aircraft only to find the bombers already gone, vanished into the vast interior of the country, flying too low for radar to track. A few pursuit planes managed to get airborne and gave chase, but the raiders had too much of a head start. Some fighters fired at long range, their bullets falling short. Others simply followed until fuel forced them to turn back. The raiders disappeared into the mountains and the gathering dusk like ghosts that had never been corporeal to begin with. For the bomber crews, the escape was as harrowing as the approach had been. With targets behind them, they turned west toward China, fuel gauges sinking toward empty. Some crews threw out everything not bolted down to save weight. Machine guns. Ammunition. Even personal items vanished out the waist gunner positions. Every pound mattered now. Every mile counted twice. Night fell as they crossed the East China Sea. Navigation became pure guesswork. Cloud cover obscured the stars. The Chinese coast appeared as a darker shadow against darkness. Some crews spotted the glow of cities and used them as reference points. Others flew on instruments alone, trusting compass headings and dwindling fuel supplies. The planned landing fields were supposed to be marked with lights, beacons guiding them to safety. But the lights never appeared. Communication failures in the early launch had left the Chinese unable to prepare. One by one, as fuel ran out, the bombers faced their final crisis. Some crews chose to bail out into the night, parachuting blind into terrain that could be mountain, forest, or ocean. Others attempted crash landings, searching desperately for flat ground, finding rice paddies or hillsides instead. Aircraft came apart on impact, pieces scattering across the landscape. Men staggered from wreckage, bloody but alive, into a country at war where Japanese occupation forces hunted Allied airmen with savage efficiency. Doolittle himself bailed out over China, landed in a rice paddy, and spent the night in a ditch convinced the mission had been a total failure. He had lost his aircraft. His crew was scattered. He had no idea if the other crews had survived. As far as he knew, the entire raid had accomplished nothing except the death of 80 good men. Morning would eventually bring better news, but that night, in the cold mud, he carried only the weight of command and the certainty of failure. Back in Tokyo, as fires burned through the night, a different kind of realization was taking hold. In the imperial palace, Emperor Hirohito demanded explanations that military leaders could not provide. In the war ministry, admirals and generals faced questions they had no answers for. How did enemy bombers reach the homeland? How did the defensive perimeter fail? How could this be allowed to happen? The questions were asked in voices cold with fury because the answers revealed something more disturbing than tactical failure. They revealed that the fundamental assumptions underlying Japan's entire defensive strategy were wrong. Newspaper editors received orders to minimize the story, but rumors spread faster than censorship could contain. People had seen the bombers. They had heard the explosions. They had watched the smoke rise. Whispering campaigns began in markets and tea houses. If Americans could bomb Tokyo, what else might be possible? If the homeland was vulnerable, where was safety? The psychological earthquake triggered by 80 men and 16 bombers rippled through Japanese society in ways no amount of propaganda could seal. The immediate military response was predictable and furious. Find the source. Punish the perpetrators. Naval forces mobilized to hunt the American carriers, but by then Task Force 18 was already racing back toward Pearl Harbor, having accomplished its mission and survived against all probability. Occupation forces in China launched brutal reprisal campaigns, searching for downed airmen and punishing any village suspected of harboring them. Some raiders were captured, tortured, and executed. Others were hidden by Chinese civilians who paid for their courage with their lives when discovered. Yet the strategic impact went far beyond the immediate aftermath. In the weeks following the raid, Japanese military planners gathered to ensure such humiliation could never be repeated. The decision was made to extend the defensive perimeter, to seize more territory, to eliminate any possible staging ground for future attacks. This thinking led directly to the Battle of Midway, where Japan would commit its carrier fleet to a trap and lose the naval superiority it had fought so hard to establish. The Doolittle raid didn't sink ships or kill thousands, but it triggered a chain reaction of strategic decisions that would ultimately prove catastrophic. 16 bombers had done what entire fleets could not. They had shattered the myth of invincibility. They had forced Japan to question its own defensive doctrine. They had demonstrated that distance was merely distance, not protection, and that determined men with enough courage could reach anywhere, strike anything, and escape to fight another day. The bombs they dropped were tiny in the scale of the war. The doubts they planted would grow until they consumed an empire. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.